For 6 years, she sat on the same corner outside First National Trust, wrapped in a blanket that used to be a cashmere throw. People stepped over her. Men in tailored suits glanced away before their eyes could settle on her face. Mothers pulled their children a little closer as they passed, the way people do when they've decided someone is invisible enough to ignore, but not invisible enough to touch. Nobody saw the woman underneath the dirt and the silence. Nobody remembered her name, though there had been a time, not so long ago, when her name was printed on buildings across 3 states. Then, on a Tuesday morning in October, a black Bentley pulled to the curb, the kind of car that never stopped in that part of town. The driver's door opened. A young man in an impeccable suit stepped out, and the entire street went quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet in years. He didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't hand her a few dollars and walk away like everyone else. He knelt down in front of her, took her hand, and said 4 words that would unravel a decade of lies. "I found you, grandmother." What he uncovered next would expose a betrayal so deep, it would change everything his family had built, and everything she had lost. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and there was a time when everyone in this city knew it. Her name was on office towers. Her name was on shipping containers and annual reports, and the brass plaque outside the very trust building she now sat beneath every single day, without anyone realizing the irony of it. Her name was the first thing people mentioned when they talked about what it meant to build something out of nothing in a city that rarely gave second chances to women who tried. But on that corner, wrapped in rags that had once been fine wool, she had no name at all. She was simply the woman nobody looked at twice, the shape people's eyes slid past on their way to somewhere important. And the young man kneeling in front of her, the one stepping out of a car worth more than most people's homes, was her own grandson. A boy she hadn't held since he was 17 years old. A boy who had spent 10 years believing a story about her that was never true. To understand how a woman like Eleanor ended up on a sidewalk with nothing but a blanket and a memory, you have to go back nearly 40 years, to a small apartment above a hardware store, on the edge of a neighborhood that no longer exists in the way it did then. A 26-year-old widow sat at a kitchen table doing math by candlelight, not because the electricity was out, but because she had made the decision to turn it off herself, past 9 o'clock, in order to save what little money remained. Her husband had died 18 months earlier, in an accident nobody had warned her would leave behind so many unanswered bills. She had one son, a stack of overdue notices, and an idea nobody around her believed in. Neighbors told her to give it up gently, the way people do when they think they're being kind. Family members told her more bluntly that a woman with no money and no husband had no business trying to build anything at all. She listened to every one of them, thanked them for their concern, and ignored every single word. Within 5 years, that idea, a small operation supplying custom parts to local manufacturers who had been let down by larger, careless suppliers, had grown into something people in the industry were beginning to notice. Within 15 years, it had become Whitmore Enterprises, a name that would eventually appear on office towers in 3 different countries, on shipping manifests crossing oceans, and in business publications that once wouldn't have printed her photograph. Eleanor built it herself, brick by brick, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice, sleeping 4 hours a night for most of a decade, because she refused to let anyone tell her the story of her life had already been written before she'd had the chance to write it herself. And through all of it, there was one person she trusted more than anyone else on this earth, more than her board, more than her closest advisors, more than herself on her hardest days. Her son, Richard. She gave Richard everything a mother could give a child, built on the back of nothing. A seat at the boardroom table before he had truly earned it through his own labor. A house in a neighborhood she herself had never been able to afford as a young widow. A future handed to him fully formed, the way she had never once been handed anything in her own life. She told herself it was simply what a mother does, that giving your child an easier road than the one you walked is the entire point of the sacrifice. She never once imagined that the same hands she had fed, clothed, and elevated would one day be the hands that pushed her out the door of the very company she had built from a card table and a candle. Daniel grew up believing his grandmother was exactly what everyone else believed her to be, a legend, untouchable. A woman who seemed larger than the room she stood in, no matter how large the room. He spent entire summers in her office as a boy, perched in the enormous leather chair across from her desk while she signed contracts that would shape the next decade of the company's future, swinging his legs because they didn't yet reach the floor. She used to tell him, in the quiet moments between phone calls, that a name means absolutely nothing if the person carrying it cannot be trusted by the people around them, and that the day he stopped trusting his own judgment in favor of someone else's version of events was the day he would begin to lose everything that actually mattered to him. He didn't know then how soon he would need to remember those words, or how badly his own family would test the truth of them. The trouble, when it began quietly, the way it almost always does in families that have learned to smile through disagreement rather than speak it aloud. Board meetings where Eleanor's opinions, once treated as gospel, were suddenly described by others in the room as old-fashioned, as though the very instincts that had built the company were now somehow a liability to it. Decisions made in smaller meetings she was no longer invited to. In rooms she used to be the one to open. Richard, now in his mid-40s, comfortable in a title that had always technically belonged to his mother, began describing her differently in conversations he assumed his son would never hear. Tired, confused, slipping. None of it was true, not a single word of it, but repeated often enough, in the right rooms, to the right people who had their own reasons to nod along, a lie starts to sound remarkably like concern. And concern, once it takes root inside a boardroom, is an extraordinarily difficult thing to argue against, because to argue against it is to sound, yourself, a little too defensive. Claire, Richard's wife, sat through most of these conversations in near silence, the kind of silence people mistake for neutrality when it is actually something closer to complicity. She had married into a family built on Eleanor's labor and had spent years quietly resenting the fact that her own name would never carry the same weight, no matter how many charity boards she joined or how many dinners she hosted for the right people. She never once raised her voice against what was happening to her mother-in-law. She simply allowed it to happen in front of her, which, as Eleanor would eventually come to understand, is its own particular kind of participation. Then came the night Eleanor sat down at her own dining room table to sign what she was told, by her own son, was a routine update to the company's operating agreement, a formality her lawyer of 30 years had supposedly already reviewed line by line. She trusted the paperwork the way she had trusted Richard for 4 decades, without reading every clause herself, because why on earth would she ever need to protect herself from her own child? That single signature, obtained through a document that was anything but routine, quietly transferred operational control of everything she had built into hands that were no longer hers. By the time she understood what she had actually signed, weeks later, when she tried to authorize a decision only to be told, politely but firmly, that the authority no longer rested with her, it was already done. There was no one left in that boardroom willing to stand beside her, because every single person in that room owed their position, in one way or another, to the man who now controlled it. Within weeks, Daniel, then 17 and about to begin his final year of high school, was informed that he would instead be finishing his education overseas, at a boarding school his father described as an extraordinary opportunity too rare to pass up. He didn't know at the time, and wouldn't understand for nearly a decade, that the decision had far less to do with his education and far more to do with removing the one person in the family who might have asked too many uncomfortable questions about where his grandmother had gone and why nobody seemed willing to answer him directly. He remembered asking, more than once, in his first year abroad, why she never called, why his letters went unanswered, why his father's explanations kept shifting slightly each time he asked. He remembered being told, eventually, to stop asking, because it was upsetting his father, and because a boy that age had no business worrying about matters he didn't fully understand. By the time Daniel came home for good, years later, his grandmother's name had quietly disappeared from company materials altogether, replaced by careful, sanitized language about a founder who had chosen to retire gracefully and step back from public life to enjoy her later years. Photographs of her were still on the walls of the corporate offices, technically, tucked into a hallway of company history rather than the boardroom where her portrait used to hang. No one corrected him when he asked, casually, where she had gone to enjoy that retirement. No one wanted to be the one to answer honestly, and so the silence simply continued, year after year, the way silence tends to when enough people find it more convenient than the truth. For 6 years, Eleanor lived a life that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the one she had built with her own hands, moving between shelters, church basements, and street corners in a city that had once celebrated her name on the evening news for opening her 100th facility. She never told anyone who she used to be, because the one time she tried, in the earliest and hardest weeks after everything fell apart, she was met with laughter and open disbelief from a woman at a shelter intake desk who had heard every version of every story a person in crisis could invent. Eleanor decided, somewhere in that first humiliating month, that it was easier to disappear entirely than to be humiliated a second time trying to convince strangers of a life they would never believe existed. So, she stopped correcting people. She stopped expecting to be believed. She learned the names of shelter workers who were kind to her, a woman named Rosa in particular, who never once asked her to explain herself and simply made sure she had a warm meal on the coldest nights. She simply survived, one day folding quietly into the next, while the family she had sacrificed everything for carried on as though she had never existed at all. There were moments during those 6 years when she came close to being recognized, closer than anyone in her family would have believed possible. An old employee, a man named Walter who had worked in her original warehouse decades earlier, once passed her on that very corner and paused, something flickering behind his eyes before he shook his head at himself and kept walking, certain that his mind was simply playing tricks on him. She watched him walk away and said nothing, because what could she possibly have said that wouldn't have sounded like the ramblings of someone the world had already decided to stop listening to? She grew used to that particular kind of loneliness, the kind where the truth sits directly in front of people and they walk past it anyway, because the story they've already accepted is so much easier to carry than the one actually in front of them. Daniel came home from overseas eventually with a business degree, a new title at his father's side, and a quiet unease he couldn't fully name, a persistent sense that the story he had grown up believing had gaps nobody around him seemed willing to acknowledge. Old employees who changed the subject the moment his grandmother's name came up in conversation. A locket he found, tucked into the back of a drawer in his father's study one afternoon, while looking for something else entirely. A locket he recognized from childhood photographs, but which no one in the family would explain. Records from her final years running the company that seemed, on closer inspection, to have been rewritten rather than simply filed away and forgotten. He told himself, the way people often do when the truth is deeply inconvenient, that it was nothing, that he was imagining patterns where none existed. But some part of him kept looking anyway, quietly, patiently, methodically, for almost a full year before anything came of it. He began, without telling his father, reaching out to former employees who had left the company around the time his grandmother's role had changed. Most declined to speak with him at all, polite but firm, the kind of politeness that itself told him something was being protected. A handful agreed to brief, careful conversations over coffee, choosing their words with the caution of people who understood exactly what they stood to lose by speaking too freely about a powerful family. From these conversations, Daniel began to piece together fragments that didn't fit the story he had been told his entire life. References to a sudden change in his grandmother's authority that none of the longtime staff had seen coming. A competency evaluation that several people vaguely recalled, but that none of them could actually describe in detail, as though it were something spoken of more than something anyone had actually witnessed firsthand. It was a Tuesday morning in October, nearly a year into his quiet search, when everything finally changed. Daniel was being driven downtown for an early meeting, scrolling absently through an old digital archive of company photographs he had requested access to weeks earlier, a habit he had developed without fully understanding why he needed to keep looking. He stopped scrolling on a photograph from a shareholders' dinner taken roughly 15 years earlier, his grandmother standing at a podium in a navy blue dress, one hand resting at her throat, on a locket he recognized immediately, the very same locket he had found hidden in his father's drawer. He looked up from his phone as the car slowed near First National Trust, and through the window he saw a woman on the corner wrapped in a blanket, her hand resting at her throat in that exact same place, an unconscious gesture so specific it stopped him cold. He told his driver to stop the car immediately. He told himself, in the same breath, that it couldn't possibly be her, that 6 years of silence and a missing woman in a city of millions didn't simply resolve themselves on an ordinary Tuesday morning during an ordinary commute. But something in the shape of her hand, the particular way she held herself, even wrapped in rags, something dignified that 6 years on the street had never quite managed to erase, refused to let him drive past. He stepped out of the car and knelt down directly in front of her, looking into eyes he hadn't seen since he was 17 years old. eyes that had aged but hadn't fundamentally changed. She didn't recognize him at first, understandably. 6 years of silence and a boy grown fully into a man standing between the person she remembered and the one now in front of her. But when he said her name softly, carefully, the exact way she used to say his own name when he was small, something in her face broke open completely, decades of held composure giving way all at once. He didn't take her to a hotel for the night or leave her with a stranger's temporary kindness and a few folded bills, the way the rest of the world had for 6 long years. He brought her directly into his own car, wrapped his coat around her shoulders, despite her protests that she would ruin the fabric, and made a single phone call, before they had even pulled away from the curb, to a lawyer named Marcus Bell, a man he trusted far more than anyone still remaining in his father's inner circle. Within hours, quiet, careful inquiries were already being made into records that had sat completely untouched for a decade, an operating agreement that had apparently never actually been reviewed by genuinely independent counsel despite what Eleanor had been told at the time, and a signature obtained under circumstances that would not survive any serious legal scrutiny. Daniel wasn't interested in confronting anyone yet. He wanted proof first. The kind of documented, undeniable proof that couldn't be argued away in a boardroom full of people whose careers depended entirely on his father's version of events remaining unquestioned. It took nearly 3 weeks to gather everything properly. 3 weeks during which Eleanor stayed quietly in Daniel's own home, sleeping in an actual bed for the first time in 6 years, still barely able to believe any of it was real each morning she woke up. She was cautious at first, flinching at kindness, the way people do when kindness has become an unfamiliar and slightly suspicious thing. She would wake before dawn out of old habit, sit near the window rather than the bed, and take small, careful bites of food, as though someone might still take it away from her. Daniel never rushed her. He simply stayed close, learning the shape of the woman she had become over 6 impossible years, a woman both harder and somehow softer than the legend he remembered from childhood. The documents Marcus Bell and his small team eventually assembled told a story far uglier than either Daniel or Eleanor had expected going in. The operating agreement Eleanor had signed at her own dining room table had been quietly altered after the fact, key language inserted well after her signature that transformed what she believed was a minor administrative update into a complete transfer of operational authority. The competency evaluation that had been used internally to justify removing her from day-to-day decisions had supposedly been conducted by a licensed physician, but records showed no appointment, no examination, and no signature that could be independently verified, only a report that appeared to have been produced entirely on request. It had all been manufactured, patiently and deliberately, by people who understood exactly how boardrooms function and exactly how easily manufactured concern can be weaponized against a person who no longer has anyone left willing to vouch for her. Daniel confronted his father in the very same boardroom where the original decision had been made a decade earlier, Eleanor seated beside him this time, dressed not in rags but in her own clothing, her hair done properly for the first time in years, her hands steady on the table in front of her. Richard's face went visibly pale the moment she walked through the door, confronted suddenly with a version of his mother he had spent 10 years training himself not to think about too closely. He reached for the same language he had used for a decade, tired, confused, difficult to manage. But the words carried no power left in them at all, not with independent legal counsel present in the room, and a thick folder of verified evidence on the table telling an entirely different story than the one he had been repeating to himself and everyone else for 10 years. Claire sat silently at the far end of the table throughout the entire meeting, unable to meet Eleanor's eyes even once, visibly carrying a guilt that made it clear she had known considerably more, for considerably longer, than she had ever admitted to her own husband, let alone to Daniel. What followed in the weeks after wasn't a public scandal splashed across headlines or a courtroom battle fought out in front of cameras, because Eleanor made it clear, quietly and firmly, that she had no interest in revenge. What she wanted was simply for the truth to be acknowledged, fully and without further distortion, by the people who owed her that acknowledgement. Richard stepped down from his position within the month, not through any dramatic legal force, but through the simple, unavoidable fact that he no longer possessed the standing to remain once the truth had become known throughout a company he had spent a decade running entirely on borrowed credibility. He offered no real apology in that final meeting, only a series of justifications that Eleanor listened to with a calm that unsettled him far more than anger ever could have. Eleanor didn't ask for her old title back, and she made that clear from the very beginning of the process. She had no genuine interest in running boardrooms again at her age, not after everything the last 6 years had already taken from her, both the things that could be measured and the things that couldn't. What she wanted was far simpler than any of them expected: a real home again, her name restored properly within the company that still bore it, and a grandson who now looked at her not as a distant legend pulled from old photographs and boardroom stories, but as a person who had endured something almost unimaginable and had never once stopped being fundamentally who she truly was underneath it. Daniel became the one to carry the company forward from that point on, not with his father's hunger for control at any cost, but with the values his grandmother had spent her entire life quietly trying to teach him, back when he was a boy sitting in a leather chair far too large for him, swinging his legs because they didn't yet reach the floor. He built her a small apartment in the same building as his own home, close enough that she never had to feel truly alone again, far enough that she could still maintain a full and independent life of her own choosing. She spent her mornings tending a small garden behind that building, something she had never had time for during her decades of building an empire, and her afternoons teaching him the parts of running a company that no business degree ever fully covers: patience, loyalty, and the simple, deliberate discipline of actually looking at the people other people have already decided to walk past. There is a version of this story where nobody stops the car that particular Tuesday morning, where a woman who built an entire company from a card table and a candle dies quietly on a sidewalk without a single person ever learning her name again. It is worth sitting with how many people might be living exactly that version of the story right now, on corners in cities across this entire country, waiting for someone, anyone, to actually look at them instead of past them the way everyone else already has. Eleanor Whitmore got her name back only because one person refused to accept the silence everyone else around him had already made an uneasy peace with. Most people, in stories like this one, never get that particular chance. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments what part of it hit you hardest, and tell us where you're watching from tonight. We genuinely love hearing from all of you. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who might need a reminder to look a little closer at the people around them, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story we bring you. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the very end.